Next we have Mega Man 3. And if I were to divide Capcom into like new Capcom versus old Capcom, I would probably draw the line at Mega Man 6. And with that in mind, Mega Man 3 would be the best thing that old Capcom produced. It's not perfect. There's some spots that you can get yourself soft locked if you really try hard to. But overall, it feels like the weapons are the most balanced. And even Rush Jet, which is incredibly broken, still feels balanced for the level design of the game. But we're not here to talk about the levels, we're here to talk about the bosses. So first up, we got Gemini Man. Now Gemini Man has two weaknesses. Oh wait, you know what? I should probably talk about the Game Boy version first. So, Gemini Man, he shows up in Mega Man 3 for Game Boy. And his weakness is the Search Snake, dealing 3 damage. He does also take 2 damage from the Shadow Blade, the Spark Shot, and the Dust Crusher. But, you know, whatever. 3 damage from the Mega Buster as well. Not a great weakness, but hey, at least you don't have to charge up the Mega Buster, right? It's a very simple fight in all 3 versions of the game that he shows up in. He will immediately create his twin, hence the Gemini in his name. And the only thing they will do is basically staying 180 degrees out from one another. They will run to the right of the room and jump over you. It's possible they could do more. I've never actually allowed them to just do this forever, but I think that is the way they work. And Gemini Man shoots every time you shoot. So you want to do this weird trick shot where you're shooting your Search Snake as you jump over him, so that either he fires the opposite direction or he fires in such a way that his bullet will go past the spot that you're going to land at before you land at it. Once you deal enough damage to the clone, you'll just have the one Gemini Man who will slow down his speed, and he just runs left and right, sometimes jumping and sometimes firing a Gemini laser. And he's really easy. He's a little bit faster in the Game Boy version than he is in the other versions, which makes him a little bit more difficult. And he also does seem to change directions a little bit arbitrarily. But onto the Genesis version, you'll see that the fight goes much the same, with the exception that when he does fire a Gemini laser, it does lag up the screen. However, in the Genesis and NES versions, he has 2 weaknesses. Search Snake, of course, is his primary weakness, dealing 5 damage. And his secondary weakness is Gemini Laser, dealing 4 damage to him. Yeah, every Robot Master in this game, their own weapon deals 4 damage to them. It's kind of a weird choice. But if we're talking about the NES version, it largely plays the same as the Genesis version. I feel like there's a little bit more room to maneuver around because the sprites are a little bit smaller. And of course, when he fires Gemini Laser, it doesn't lag up the screen. It's not too bad all around. Pretty easy fight. I know when I was a kid, I got killed by him a lot until I learned how to properly deal with his clones. I think it's a good fight. I'm gonna have to put this guy in the A tier. Yeah, probably above Time Man even. Like it's a good fight on the NES. There's a lot to learn there. It's not just a freebie. It's not overly difficult. Yeah, Gemini Man, my man. You know what? He might even be my first S tier. How's that sound? So next up on this list is Hardman. And contrary to his name, he's not very hard. But he is kind of obnoxious. In all three versions, there is a difference, but it's not a difference based on the fight itself. He basically has the same AI and attack pattern in all three versions. The difference is the weapon. Now, his primary weakness in all three games is the magnet missile. But in Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy, where he'll take 3 damage from the magnet missile and the needle cannon. But in Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy, his fist that he fires out, which his pattern is to fire out 2 fists that kind of track to your vertical location, and then they return to him as he jumps in the air, flips upside down, and pounds into the ground, which freezes you in place, similar to Gutsman. But it doesn't, whether you're on the ground or in the air, it doesn't matter. And then he just repeats that. So in the Game Boy version, his fists will block your magnet missiles, which is kind of obnoxious. And it does drag out the fight a bit. And then when we look at the Genesis version, we've got an entirely different issue. Which, I will remind you that his weakness on the Genesis and NES version is the magnet missile dealing 4 damage, and also the hard knuckle deals 4 damage. But, yeah, on the Genesis version, and I've talked about this previously in the Mega Man 2 video during the Doc Robot fights, but magnet missile, for whatever reason, in the Genesis version, tracks to projectiles. I don't understand this. It doesn't make sense. All the projectiles are obviously invincible to it. It makes no sense at all for them to track to it. So that makes it difficult to hit Hardman in a similar yet different way. You kind of have to get close to him. But then we have the NES version of the fight, which is obviously the best version of the fight. Because magnet missiles, they don't get blocked, and they don't track to projectiles. So you can just fire them and not have to worry too much about your aim. The big obstacle with Hardman is obviously avoiding his fists and then not getting slammed down on top of by him. The fists don't do a whole lot of damage, but if he makes contact damage with you, that does a ton. It's actually kind of a decent fight. I think I would probably put it above Flashman in the B tier. Next up is Magnet Man. Now, Magnet Man, like Hardman, appears in Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy. And he takes 3 damage from the needle cannon, because his normal weakness is not in Mega Man 2. And also 3 damage from the magnet missile. Which, kind of weird, because there's no rematch. There's no way to ever actually fight him with the magnet missile. I don't believe. I don't know. Anyway. So, the fight goes the same in all 3 versions, with minor differences. His basic pattern is he'll make a short hop to the middle of the room, and then a big hop to the opposite side of the room from where he started. Once he reaches the opposite side of the room, he will do one of 2 things. He will either jump and shoot 3 magnet missiles, which we've talked about magnet missile enough in this series so far that you should have an idea how it works. It tracks to your it fires out horizontally, tracks to the location of the first thing that it detects as an enemy it can fire at, whether it's right or wrong, and then it either goes up or down depending on which way it needs to go to actually hit the thing. He'll fire 3 of these and then land and then repeat the cycle. The other thing he can do is use his magnetic barrier, which will draw you in and also makes him invulnerable while he's using it. In the Game Boy version, the minor difference is that his hops are a little bit shorter, which is to be expected with the screen crunch. But But despite this, he still does go down fairly quickly to the needle cannon. In the Genesis version, the fight is much the same. Our minor difference here is that, for whatever reason, his magnetic barrier has a bigger hitbox. And this is visually represented. I think I actually got hit by it in my footage because it's got a bigger hitbox. His hops are the normal size, a little bit lower than they are in the NES version because the sprites are bigger, but it doesn't really matter here because it's high enough that it's going to hop over Mega Man no matter what. The Game Boy version, it wasn't actually high enough to hop over him unless you slid under him. So, in the Genesis and NES version, Magnet Man has a weakness to the Spark Shot, which deals 7 damage. And a secondary weakness is actually the Shadow Blade, which also deals 7 damage to him. Interesting. Magnet Missiles, of course, does 4 damage to him. In the NES version, which is the best version of the fight, I mean, it really does play out the same as the Genesis version. You hit him a couple times with a Spark Shot and he's done. You just hope he doesn't do the magnetic barrier. You know, you bait the magnet missiles. It's a very simple fight. Doesn't really do anything too great. There's a bit of waiting around if you get bad RNG and you get a lot of magnetic barriers. So for that reason, I think we'll put him below Oil Man in the B tier. Next up is Needle Man. Needle Man's an interesting fight. He has kind of an erratic pattern, and there's several things he can do. He can do a short hop and fire a couple needles at you. He can do a big hop and fire like 2 sets of a couple needles at you. Or he can jump to Mega Man's location and try to either jump and fire needles, or once he's within range, he might bend forward and shoot his head out a few blocks worth of space, try to deal contact damage to Mega Man. And it's more of a reactionary fight than it is learning a pattern, because there really does seem to be no rhyme or reason to which attack he's going to do when. In the Game Boy version of Mega Man 2 is where we'll find Needle Man. He has a secondary weakness from the air shooter, which is appropriate because he's a pretty jumpy boy. But his primary weakness is the top spin, dealing 5 damage as opposed to air shooters 2. I think it's probably easier to hit him with the top spin, just because he has a tendency to track to your location when he jumps. But if he doesn't, and he shoots needles at you, air shooter is definitely an easy way to hit him. In the Genesis and NES version, however, Needle Man is weak to the Gemini laser, dealing 7 damage, and of course 4 damage from the needle cannon. In the Genesis version, our primary difference here from the NES version, besides sprites being a little bit bigger, is the lag generated by the Gemini laser. I really haven't decided if this is a good or bad thing, because I think once it hits a wall and rebounds, it stops lagging for some reason. It's a little weird, but it can make it where you're using the slowdown to avoid the needles, and then all of a sudden everything goes back to normal. So I would probably say that lag is a bad thing, but that's fine, because that lag doesn't exist in the NES version, which is what I'm judging these Robot Masters off of. And I gotta say, this Robot Master was designed really well, because in all 3 versions of the fight, he really does kinda jump into the weapons that he's meant to be fought with. Like, every single one of them. Gemini Laser, for whatever reason, because he's such a jumpy boy, he tends to jump into the laser's path, like, all the time. Even if you miss, there's a very good chance it's going to rebound and hit him. Like, I love that about this fight, because the Gemini Laser, very unwieldy weapon. You can only fire one at a time. You can't bring up your pause menu until it goes away. I don't like using it for all of these reasons. But it works very well against Needleman. So, while I think the fight probably would lose a few points for being so erratic, I just think that the way they have designed him in all three of these games to just work so well with his weakness, I think that puts him up in the A tier. And it's funny that I trashed on Gemini Laser so much, because next up is Shadow Man. And in Mega Man 3, which does not have Top Man in it, for Game Boy, that is, his weakness is Gemini Laser, dealing 3 damage. And it puts very well on display everything I hate about the Gemini Laser. It does lag things up in the GB version, and it's not great against Shadow Man. It's less likely you will miss, because he does tend to stay a little more horizontal, or horizontally aligned with you than Needleman does. But if you do miss, it bounces around so much more than it does on the NES. Yeah, not great. Shadow Man has a pretty simple pattern despite what everybody thinks. He just does a couple hops, and then he'll do a big hop, and then he'll throw Shadow Blades, one diagonally up and one horizontally towards you simultaneously. But what gets everybody is he can slide. I think he's the only Robot Master in the entire series that can slide. And he does this seemingly totally randomly. I thought it might have been like a proximity thing, but I actually didn't get any footage of him sliding at all. It's really weird. On the NES version, he is, of course, weak to the Shadow Blade, dealing 4 damage to him. But his true weakness is the top spin, which deals 7 damage. They fixed the top spin bug on the Genesis version, so it's not as painful there. And I know I got like blessed footage where I didn't actually trigger this bug somehow when I did the NES fight. But on the NES version, top spin is glitched so that I think it uses a pip of energy every frame that you are making contact with something while using it. So most people's fight with Shadow Man is he just jumps directly on them. They're in the middle of his hitbox. They use top spin. They get one hit and their entire bar just depletes completely. Because he's got invincibility frames, he only takes the 1 damage, or the 1 hit from top spin. So it only takes 7 damage. In my fight, I guess I've kind of learned how to use top spin. You get it's a lot like Sonic's Insta Shield in Sonic 3, which is something that I enjoy using. You just kind of got to learn that little bit of extra hitbox that it puts outside of your own hitbox that damages enemies. And it really is a difficult weapon to use. I'm not going to lie. I have played this game hundreds of times, and I have only just within the last couple playthroughs begun to learn how to use the top spin correctly. Shadow Man is not a good fight. It's too erratic. The slide is too random. Like, even his little hops, there's no real rhyme or reason to whether it's going to be a small hop or a big hop. he seems more likely that he'll do 2 small hops and then a big hop and then shoot his Shadow Blades, but sometimes he'll just do 1. I mean, there's no tells for any of this. It's super reactionary, and then the fact that he can seemingly just slide whenever he feels like it makes it almost impossible to actually deal with him. For that, I think he goes at the bottom of the C tier. Next up is Snake Man, and I think I can already tell you, he goes in the S tier. This is a very, very solid fight. He's not the easiest fight. Not a total pushover. But if you wanted to try and learn how to do all the Robot Masters with a Buster only and not taking a hit, this guy would be prime candidate to start with. It is such a well done fight. In all 3 versions of the game, he has the same pattern. He will run left and right, and sometimes he'll shoot out 2 Search Snakes in your direction. The thing that makes the fight tricky is the level geometry, where he has raised platforms on the sides and then an even bigger thin platform in the center that he has to jump over. The only time he jumps is when he's encountering one of these. I think he might sometimes jump if you try to jump over him. But I found that the only way you're really going to ever jump over him without taking damage is to jump over him from the center platform. I think any other way to avoid taking damage from him involves sliding underneath him. In the Game Boy version of Mega Man 3, we do not have Needle Man, so his weakness instead is the Spark Shot, which deals 3 damage to him. And for some reason is blocked by the Search Snakes. I don't know if it does that in the NES version. I've never actually checked. In the Genesis version, again, the fight is basically the same. It feels a little less cramped than the Game Boy version, since it's not screen crunch, but a little more so than the NES version because the sprites are bigger. His weakness in the Genesis and NES version is, of course, the Search Snake dealing 4 damage to him, but also the Needle Cannon. And I think this is a good weapon for him because it goes through the platforms, it stays horizontally. There's a little bit of variance where the needles shoot from your location, so it's pretty good for a hoppy guy like this. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about Snake Man. Just an all-around really satisfying fight to learn. Next up is Spark Man. And this is another Robot Master that really relies on the level geometry to bring the fight to life. His stage kind of looks like a middle finger, but this Robot Master does not walk. He just jumps. And they kind of messed up his pattern in the Game Boy version a little bit, because it just seems like he'll hop a bit and then he'll either shoot a big charged up spark shot at you, or he will create the spark ball above his head that explodes into every direction. He is in Mega Man 3 for Game Boy, where his weakness is the Shadow Blade, dealing 3 damage. And basically, the whole gist of the fight is you want to try and dodge him, which you can't really slide to get under him. So I don't know how you can do this without getting hit if you're not just super fast at killing him. And get your shots in where you can. The Genesis version and the NES version basically go the same. He is weak to the Shadow Blade, which deals 4 damage, and the Spark Shot, which deals 4 damage. His pattern is different than the Game Boy here. It's better. He will still hop around a couple times. It's not a set number of times. It seems to be like 2 to 4 times that he hops. before he will stop, and he will create the ball that explodes in all directions, and then immediately follow that up with a charged up spark shot. And that's kind of the core of the pattern here, is figuring out how to avoid the shot when he shoots it in all directions, and then hopping over or baiting, actually. You can bait the big shot. And and then returning fire with your Shadow Blades. It's a pretty good fight. It's difficult to avoid him, and I think for that, I can't, in good conscience, put it in the B tier, because there's just no real good way to avoid getting hit by him. So I could probably put him at the top of the C tier, though, because in a lot of ways he's pretty similar to Woodman with his issues. And that brings us to the last Robot Master of Mega Man 3, Top Man. I don't like Top Man. He's not so bad in the Game Boy version because his tops move a little bit slower. But his pattern is, in all three versions, that he will make a diagonal line of 3 tops that after a set amount of time will all home in on Mega Man's location. And then afterwards he will start spinning, making him invulnerable to attack. And after a random interval, he will spin across the screen and just repeat the pattern. What I don't like about him is that random interval, because it can be quite long, and it can also be quite short. And it can really throw you off. In all 3 versions of the game that he shows up in, he is weak to the Hard Knuckle. In Mega Man 2 for Game Boy, he takes 4 damage to it. And it's not as bad to use here because the weapon just kind of fires off and goes. It's probably the best version of the Hard Knuckle, if I'm being honest. The problem comes on the Genesis and NES version, where he is also weak to the top spin, dealing 4 damage to him, but takes 7 from the Hard Knuckle. In the Genesis version, the Hard Knuckle actually works differently than the NES version, so it's probably a little bit worse on the Genesis version. The Hard Knuckle itself does not have a hitbox until it starts moving, so you can only get 1 shot off unless you want to eat a hit from his tops. You can get 2 max each cycle before he starts spinning. On the NES version, it's a little bit easier to get 2 hits before the tops move, because the Hard Knuckle has a hitbox the moment it spawns. It's still difficult though, and there's probably the reason why the Hard Knuckle works the way it does in the Genesis, because there's like a weird glitch with it. You only see it in the rematches against Top Man. If you get the last hit on Top Man with the Hard Knuckle and you're right next to him, so the Hard Knuckle spawns inside of him, for whatever reason you just can't move for a few seconds. It doesn't harm anything, it just freezes you in place for like 5 seconds. You know, just enough to make you wonder if your game froze. But yeah, Top Man, I think I gotta put him in the D tier. That's not fair. This fight doesn't have problems, it just sucks. Probably not as much as Shadow Man, Bubble Man. Yeah, I could put him below Crash Man in the C tier. And that would be the end of the video. However, since I've been covering the Genesis version of the fights, it feels only right to include the 3 other quote-unquote Robot Masters that were on the Genesis version of the game. They were the ones that you fought in the Wily Tower, and this will kind of serve as like our farewell to the Genesis version as we move forward with this tier list, because after this I don't have any more Genesis to cover. So I can't make a full video with just 3 guys, so we're going to cram it here at the end of Mega Man 3. So bonus time! Okay, first up, we got Buster Rod G. This guy is a monkey. He is based on the character Sun Wukong from the Chinese novel Journey to the West. And I apologize if I butcher these Chinese names. I did not look it up beforehand. I'm just doing my best guess based on how much I've heard of names and such from the language. Just to get things out of the way, he does have a second fight in the actual Wily Tower itself, which is different completely from the first fight. I didn't actually play through this whole game when I was getting my footage, so I don't remember if there were proper rematches, but I don't think there are. So, Wily Tower allows you to use any of the weapons and support abilities from Mega Man 1, 2, and 3. So, they've got a lot of weaknesses here. So, let me start out with the Mega Man 1 weapons. The only Mega Man 1 weapon that deals any considerable damage to Buster Rod G's second encounter is the Rolling Cutter at 3 damage. The Mega Man 2 weapons, you get 4 damage from the Air Shooter, 4 from the Leaf Shield, and 2 from the Quick Boomerang. And the Mega Man 3 weapons, you get 2 from the Needle Cannon, 4 from the Magnet Missile, and then the weapon that you see me use in the footage, his best weakness, probably the Hard Knuckle, dealing 6 damage. The fight itself, at first it looks interesting because you get into it and it's like, oh wow, this is different from the first time. It's not all that interesting. You have these platforms and he spawns on the other side of the room and he will shoot bullets at you occasionally, and I believe they are locked to like cardinal directions rather than tracking exactly where you are like some of the Robot Masters have been able to do. But the gimmick to the fight you'll soon see is that the platforms start falling, and eventually you'll see new platforms falling from the top, so this fight can go on for a while. Once the platform that Buster Rod G is standing on gets near the bottom, he's going to jump to a different platform. And then he's just going to stand there and occasionally shoot a shot in one of the cardinal directions toward you. It's not a great fight. I did want to show it off though, because it is another version of the fight with Buster Rod G. But the real fight is the first encounter in his stage, which is really cool because I've watched a lot of Dragon Ball. You know, Goku was based on the same character that Buster Rod G is based on, so a lot of these things seemed familiar to me, such as the power pole that extends, which you can do from the ground, and you can also do in the air, which kind of tracks your location when he does it. The spinning the rod to reflect your shots is another attack he has. And my personal favorite was the after image technique that he used to move to the other side of the screen. It was, I was really impressed with how much this guy could do, and at the same time it still felt like a fair fight. Like, this was a really good fight. His weaknesses, his main weakness is the Hyper Bomb. It deals 8 damage. That's a ton of damage. He also takes 3 damage from the Rolling Cutter. He takes 4 damage from the Air Shooter, 4 damage from the Bubble Lead, 2 damage from the Quick Boomerang, and he will take 3 damage from a middle charge Atomic Fire and 9 from a fully charged Atomic Fire. And he also takes 2 damage from the Needle Cannon and 8 from the Hard Knuckle, which could be another weapon to use. I prefer the Hyper Bomb because it won't be reflected from his spinning of the power pole like the Hard Knuckle will. I think this guy's another S tier. This is a pretty good fight. I'm sorry. Sorry, not sorry. He's a good fight. I really enjoyed this guy. I just wish I could fight him in a more isolated setting so I could really learn how to fight him and maybe buster him. But yeah, on to the next one. Next up is Hyperstorm H. And this guy is based on the character, again, I apologize for butchering pronunciation, Zhu Baji from the Chinese novel Journey to the West. And this guy is a big boy. Oh yes, he is a big boy. He has 2 health bars. Despite what you might think by his size, he doesn't actually paralyze you when he jumps on the ground. So that's good to know. His weaknesses are 3 damage. No, oh, sorry, wrong person. 6 damage from the Hyper Bomb, which is what I went with. 3 damage from the Firestorm. Not a bad choice because of the shield that it puts around you. 2 damage from the Metal Blade. 2 damage from Crash Bomb. 2 damage from just a regular shot from the Atomic Fire. 3 from a mid-charge shot and 6 from a fully charged shot. 2 damage, 2 damage from the Gemini Laser, 2 damage from Spark Shot, 2 damage from Shadow Blade. Wouldn't really bother with any of those, especially Gemini Laser. Oh, jeez. Could you imagine? Yeah, I wouldn't bother with Metal Blades or Crash Bomber. Atomic Fire was an interesting choice just because the weak shot does more than one. I think that's the only time I've seen that. Except for one of the Wily machines in Wily Tower. But anyway, his pattern is not too difficult to deal with. He has an interesting arena. He has spikes on both the left wall and the right wall. And the main strategy he employs is he sucks you in for a while, similar to the magnet barrier that Magnet Man uses. And then he'll start blowing away. And while he's blowing, he'll also fire some lemons at you. It's interesting. And then after that, he will start slowly making small hops across the screen. Every time he lands, he drops 2 Mets on the ground, which aren't really hard to deal with. And then he repeats the pattern. He's not a bad fight. He's not super interesting, though. It's pretty simple. I would probably put him towards the top of the B tier. And our last Robot Master here is Mega Water S, which is based on the character Sha Wujing, which was a river sprite in Journey to the West. And he looks like a Kappa, which I guess, why not? One thing I didn't mention is that these guys do have a different numbering system. They're not in the DLN/DWN series. These guys are in the WWN series, with Buster Rod G being WWN1, Mega Water S being WWN02, and Hyperstorm H being WWN03. Now, Mega Water S is weak 2. 3 damage from the Ice Slasher, 3 damage from the Hyper Bomb. Really don't want to use Atomic Fire because he just takes 3 from a mid shot and a fully charged shot. Like, you're just throwing away weapon energy if you use a fully charged shot. He also takes 2 damage from the Search Snake. He doesn't really have much in the way of weaknesses, but that's fine. That really allows you to see the gimmick to his fight, which at first I was confused about. He has a very unique arena. He has a platform on the left, a platform on the right, and in the center are spikes. And above those spikes is another platform in the center, like the very center of the screen. And immediately when the fight starts, he's going to jump onto that platform and he's just going to kind of walk left and right and try to harpoon you like you're a fish and he's trying to spearfish you. And like I said, I was confused at first. I was wondering if he was going to do anything else. It seems the other part of his strategy is if you try to get on the platform to fight him, he's going to shoot water at you to push you off so that he can harpoon you, which is kind of interesting. But I mean, you see how much care they put into Buster Rod G and even Hyperstorm H. Next to those two, Mega Water S looks kinda lacking. It's an interesting fight, but it just doesn't do a whole lot. And I think for that, I'm going to have to put it at the bottom of the B tier. And, that does it for the Genesis. We won't be looking at the Genesis version anymore. And I just want to say, while I think Wily Wars is a bad port of Mega Man 1, 2, and 3, especially 1 and 2, 3 is mostly tolerable because it was clear that they made an engine based on Mega Man 3, and the other two games kind of had to adapt to it. But Wily Tower is actually pretty good. It does suck that you have to complete Mega Man 1, 2, and 3 on your save file before you can access it, but if you have a way to play the Wily Wars, download you a save file that has completed Mega Man 1, 2, and 3, and just play the Wily Tower. It's really good. There is also a 8-bit demake of Wily Tower out now that, as far as I am aware, I haven't played it, but as far as I am aware, it's complete, except for the final phase of the final boss. So, yeah, check that out if you'd rather take that route. But that's going to do it for Mega Man 3 and Wily Wars.